Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the NAACP Arlington Branch's Housing Equity Best Practices discussion with Demetria McCain, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. My name is Kellen Macbeth, and I am an at-large member of the Executive Committee for the branch, as well as the former chair of the Housing Committee. I'd like to thank our branch president, Michael Heminger, secretary, Wanda Younger, housing committee chair, Wells Harrell, and communications committee chair, Leah Matterall, for their help putting this event together. I would also like to thank HUD for their support as well. Today, we're having a discussion with Demetria about fair housing and housing equity, just in time for Fair Housing Month. So happy Fair Housing Month, everyone. Demetria is going to open with some remarks, followed by a discussion with her and I. We're going to wrap it up close to the end of the hour with probably time for maybe a question or two from audience members. If you would like to ask a question, please put it in the chat, but remain on mute during the event. I'll be monitoring the chat and I will select questions for Demetria from there. I'd like to just give a brief background and introduction for Demetria. So, as I said, she currently serves as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. For FHEO, McCain assists HUD's efforts with to eliminate housing discrimination, promote economic opportunity, and achieve diverse, inclusive communities. She joins HUD following 15 years of service, with 5 as president at the Inclusive Communities Project, a Dallas, Texas-based affordable fair housing nonprofit. Prior to becoming president, she oversaw operations, communications, and ICP's Mobility Assistance Program, a housing mobility program that helps housing choice voucher holders exercise their fair housing rights. Conceived by Demetria, ICP's Voices for Opportunity initiative has provided advocacy training to low-income renters and neighborhood groups of color. Before joining ICP, she worked on USDA Section 515, Rural Multifamily Housing Matters at the National Housing Law. She also was a staff attorney for the Neighborhood Legal Services Program of Washington, D.C., assigned to the Southeast office, where her portfolio primarily included landlord-tenant matters for low-income renters in private and public housing. She is taught as an adjunct instructor a fair housing and homelessness course to undergraduate Coppin State University students. She brings dual vantage points to FHEO after having spent years assisting both housing choice voucher holders who sought low poverty, well-resourced housing options and neighborhood groups in underserved communities of color who sought more equitable distribution of resources and services. She has sat on several local and national nonprofit boards and is a sought-after panelist and commentator on affordable, fair housing and the impacts of residential segregation. She is a graduate of Howard University School of Law, New York University, and Brooklyn College, and a member of the Dallas alumni chapter of Delta Sigma Theta sorority. And so with that, I would like to turn it over to Demetria for some remarks.
Thank you so much, Kellen. Thank you, entire branch, Arlington, Virginia branch of NAACP. I really, really, really appreciate this opportunity. And I usually do lots of speaking engagements during Fair Housing Month, but I got to tell you, you are the first for 2024. So it's an honor to be here, virtually though, right? So thank you. And let me just say that speaking of Fair Housing Month, it was 56 years ago when Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Was assassinated. And that came after he had moved his family to all the way across the country, all the way to Chicago. They actually lived in Chicago so that they had an opportunity to experience some of the fair housing problems that advocates there were going through. And as folks, some of you folks might know this. I'm not sure everyone knows this though, but it was just 7 days after his assassination that the Fair Housing Act became law. That kind of motivated Congress and the president to get it done. It had been lingering for quite some time. So I'll say in doing so, this law really kind of moved our country to address the entrenched discrimination that was existing in the housing market at the time. And I always want to make sure that people understand that the Fair Housing Act prohibits things based on 7 protected classes, right? And those that people don't always know all of them because some of them are less known, but they include race, color, national origin, sex, including gender identity and sexual orientation, religion, disability, and familial status. And when I say familial status, that has to do with people under the age of 18 being in the household, be that somebody who is pregnant or about to become a parent, fostering, what have you. And let me just also say that this civil rights law truly has impacted millions of people since 1968. But despite this law, folks, as many of you know, not everyone has escaped the actual pains that housing discrimination creates. And in addition to that, there's a part of the Fair Housing Act that is often forgotten. People don't really know about it. It's called the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Mandate. It's a mouthful, and some of us refer to it as AFFH. That's in there. It's been in there since 1968, part of that statute since 1968. It has remained law ever since. What the heck does that mean? Well, let me just say that it requires the administration of HUD programs and activities to be carried out in a manner that affirmatively furthers the policies of the Fair Housing Act, right? So to affirmatively further fair housing, that's more than simply sitting back saying, hey, I don't discriminate, right? That's really kind of more passive, right? So that word affirmative is in there intentionally. And so I want to say that last year, HUD published a draft rule, actually, and that was entitled Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. And when we published that draft rule, we actually sought comments from the entire public to see what they thought about that draft rule. Now, that proposed rule, once finalized, would implement the Fair Housing Act's statutory mandate to affirmatively further fair housing, that requiring agencies and program participants like states, counties, certain municipalities, public housing agencies to proactively take meaningful action to eliminate disparities in opportunity, to foster inclusive communities that are free from discrimination, to overcome patterns of segregation. That's what we put in that proposed rule. And so as we finalize that draft rule, let me say that we are anticipating publishing that in the coming weeks. I know that's a big question we have from lots of folks. I just want to go ahead and put that out there, that we're hoping that that gets finalized and published in the coming weeks. So I strongly encourage you to join the HUD listserv so that you can hear about it when it is made final. And if you want to join that listserv, just go to HUD.gov and you'll figure out how to sign up to get our press releases, and that way you can hear about it. And so let me just say that we know there's a lot much more to do, folks, as far as discrimination goes, to not only to undo the systemic discrimination that was created in the 20th century that actually continues to plague us now, which actually was referenced in President Biden's January 2021 memo to HUD. But we know that we've got to address the perpetuating harms from that systemic discrimination and address the new harms that continue to burden individuals, communities, and really our entire nation. So there's a whole lot of work to do. And so I certainly look forward to making sure that these policies are actually implemented and benefit everybody and benefit our whole country. But let me just share this as well. Let me share that my office, FHEO, Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity Office, FHEO works with our state and local partners through a couple of programs that we have. We have a program called the Fair Housing Initiatives Program, and then we have a program called the Fair Housing Assistance Program. And everyone should know that these fair housing partners of ours are hugely important to us. And so when it comes to the Fair Housing Initiatives Program, and we call that FIP, in Virginia, you guys have Housing Opportunities Made Equal of Virginia. Sometimes they call themselves Home of Virginia, and that's a big partner of ours. Also, as far as other agencies that take fair housing cases that we refer to them, those are our FAPs, right? Our Fair Housing Assistance Programs. And so you've got your state fair housing agency, and you also have there the Fairfax Human Rights Commission in Virginia as well. And so HUD and HUD partners actually receive and address complaints day in and day out. And I just want to give you a flavor, and this is just a minute flavor of the type of complaints that come into our offices. One, let's say, for instance, reasonable accommodation requests by someone who has a disability. Those kind of reasonable accommodation requests that have been ignored by property management and owners, causing people with disabilities to actually live inhumanely, right? Complaints like a landlord denied rental to a young Black woman because of her race, and then placing the discriminatory ads, right, online, and then making discriminatory statements to this person, and then later retaliating against her when she was trying to affect her fair housing rights. That's another type. And then there is the type where we've got an owner discriminating against a tenant based on sex, while that person is being prohibited from self-expression, right? Transgender tenant being told to dress like a man, talk like a man, act like a man. And then we have things that affect lots of people, those types of complaints. Multiple entities and individuals who actually perpetuated a scheme to deceive distressed homeowners of Caribbean descent into forfeiting their titles to their homes. Now, folks, you know how hard it is to buy a home, right? And so to get somebody to trick you into forfeiting title to your home, can you imagine how hurtful that is? And let me just say, while this just really minute snapshot of the type of cases we take, let me just say that there are a lot of cases that simply don't go reported at all. And I would say, for instance, we've got cases based on religion, right? That's our lowest category when we look at the numbers every year. But we all know, right, that hate is taking place around the country like crazy as it relates to religion. Now, disability and race are our biggest categories of cases that we see. But let me just say that religion remains a protected class, which is why this last year, in coordination with the White House's federal interagency effort to combat anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, my office issued a memorandum entitled Ensuring Fair Housing Act Amidst Ongoing Religious Discrimination in the United States. Sent that over to our staff, sent it over to our FIP partners, our FAP partners, just reminding everyone to keep a watchful eye out for housing discrimination based on religion. And let me just say, just last month, we issued a resource entitled Tenant Background Checks and Your Rights. That was actually released jointly with the Department of Justice, Federal Trade Commissions, Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, and us, right? We also released another item on our website for the public's consumption. It's called No Good Cause for Discrimination. Some evictions are never allowed. Because people, believe it or not, have been facing evictions left and right. And sometimes if they're based on violations to the Fair Housing Act, of course, those evictions are not allowed. So we wanted to make sure people understood that. And I could go on and on and on and on about some of our activities we do in this regard, but I hope that gives you a sense of some of the things that we handle. And I just want you to know that with the policies we're trying to enact under this administration, please know that HUD cares. Please know. And so with that, Cullen, I'm happy to entertain any type of dialogue you'd like for us to engage in.
Thank you so much for Demetria. There's a lot that you said that I do want to touch on, and I have some questions about. And I know I'm very excited about the affirmatively furthering for housing final rule, as you said, that's said to come out in a few weeks, and the work that the administration's been doing to move that forward and make sure that HUD recipients of funds are proactively engaging and making their communities more equitable, getting rid of segregation that's been in place for decades, and in some cases getting worse. So I want to touch on that. But first, I wanted to ask you kind of a broader question. And I know this could be a little bit challenging to answer, but what are, in your view, the most pressing fair housing issues impacting the United States today?
Well, Caroline, let me just say that I'm not here to talk about my personal view. right? But let me just say that my personal view, quite frankly, is aligned with the view of the administration. And I think that we can really kind of understand some of the most pressing issues. Sometimes those are really, you asked about the nation, but sometimes those are very local. And so I would first say that it's important to maybe stay connected to your FIP, for instance, to see, get a sense of what's going on locally. But I think that we can understand some of the pressing issues based on the Biden-Harris administration's priorities through their executive orders, right, and public statements. For instance, we had the president's executive order on racial equity. Not only was that released in 2021, but there's also was redone a second version of that in 2023. So when you ask about priorities and issues facing us, the nation, the fact that we had even a second executive order on racial equity, which includes not just housing, but other issues as well, I think that gives you a sense that, as I mentioned earlier, there are systemic things that have not been undone just yet. And so that's really critical. I think also we've got an executive order on climate and environmental justice. We settled a case last year, an environmental justice case under our Title VI authority, because we don't just have authority under the Fair Housing Act. We also have authority under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We settled a case with the city of Chicago as it relates to environmental justice. So that's still important, right? That's still pressing. It's not happening everywhere. I don't know that it's happening in Virginia per se, right? So that's why it's really important to get local. But from a national perspective, these executive orders don't just come out of nowhere, right? They come out of they're informed by real people on the ground, people with lived expertise, policymakers, data, research. Another priority, both of the Biden-Harris administration and of HUD, is issues as relates to second chances and those folks who are returning citizens to our communities, right? They've served their time, and now it's time for them to serve and make themselves great citizens who are able to contribute, right? And so second chances are hugely important because we know that there are a lot of people who have struggles getting housing once they are reentering. Issues as it relates to the LGBTQI plus community. The president issued an executive order after the U.S. Supreme Court Bostock decision. Also issued a second executive order as it relates to young people and youth who are part of this community. So those are some of the pressing issues I would say that are taking place right now.
Thank you very much for that. You had previously talked about the administration's efforts around AFFH. And as you said, this has long been a part of the Fair Housing Act, but it was essentially overlooked for many decades. And it was not something that was I would say, a primary focus for the federal government and certainly not for a lot of localities and states across the country. And since the NAACP Arlington branch, we're very much focused on, what we can do to make our community better. What are some things that localities like Arlington should be aware of and be thinking about when it comes to understanding AFFH rulemaking and kind of what that means for a community like Arlington or other, similarly situated counties or cities across the country?
Yeah, well, the rulemaking process can be a little tricky and maybe a little difficult to understand sometimes. So thank you for the question. If you could just give me a little latitude here, I'd like to kind of flesh out kind of where we've been the last couple of years as it relates to this, so folks can understand. So as I mentioned earlier, and as Kellen just kind of reiterated, this has been law since 1968, but the implementation of that has not been as robust as it could be. Right. And so under the Obama administration, there was an affirmatively furthering fair housing rule that came out. Administrations changed, and then that rule was put on the back burner, for lack of a better word. But when the Biden-Harris administration came back, what they did was they took the time to issue an interim final rule, right? Interim. And they did that immediately back in 2021. And in doing so, they actually restored the implementation of the affirmatively furthering fair housing requirement, right? And so what does that mean? That means that HUD program participants, let's say grantees of funds from HUD, public housing agencies who are in in contract with HUD, they actually, when they're taking funding from us, they need to certify that they are affirmatively furthering fair housing. And so that certification piece was brought back in 2021, and it exists today, even though we're still waiting for a final rule of this new version. And that new version builds upon the 2015 version. And so that's important for people to know that that requirement exists now. Now, also, let me just say that that interim final rule, like I said, interim while we're waiting for this final one to come out, that interim final rule actually provides some robust definitions of what it means to affirmatively fair housing, right? So when they're certifying, they know what they're certifying to, because they've got a robust definition there. And so that's important to understand. And so since the interim final rule, we actually have invited and have seen jurisdictions and program participants voluntarily engage in the fair housing planning process without waiting for the final rule, right? So our office actually has helped folks. We've provided technical assistance. We told people when we issued the interim final rule, we'll help you with the voluntary process if you want to get started on some fair housing planning activities. And so that's what we've done, and that's what we've been doing alongside writing the draft rule, getting public comments on the draft rule, and now finalizing that final rule. And so going back to your first question, I would say part of that technical assistance that we issued for folks who were going through this voluntary process included what we call a fair housing planning toolkit. I cannot say enough about our staff who put this toolkit together. Our staff, FHEO staff, as well as our Office of General Counsel, worked together to put together this fair housing planning toolkit for folks like you all, for communities, for grantees, for public housing agencies. And let me just say that this fair housing planning toolkit, and I'll try to send you the link, Kellen, so you can share it with everybody. It has 8 modules, okay? And each of those 8 modules have their own set of objectives for people to read and understand. Kellen, if I have time, I like to kind of go through this list of the modules, if that's okay, so people have a sense of what's in there.
Yes, that works.
Okay, so there's module 1 is the Fair Housing Act, background on fair housing planning, right? Module 2 is preparing for fair housing planning and data analysis. Module 3 is analyzing programs, policies, practices, and procedures for a fair housing plan. And then one that may be of particular interest to this audience, module 4, right, is all about community participation in fair housing planning. And to give you a sense of the objectives under that particular module, one is learn who needs to be engaged in fair housing planning from the community, right? That's critical. There are parts of communities that people don't always think about, but everybody should be engaged. Another objective under the community participation piece is learn what are the best practices for community participation. That's in there. That's in our fair housing planning toolkit. And also under module 4, one of the objectives is learn how to reach protected class populations and organizations that actually advocate for those types of protected classes. So remember, I mentioned earlier the 7 protected classes. And so it's important to include all 7 of those protected classes when doing the outreach, right? And let me just, if I could take a moment of personal privilege here, I always like to stress that things are intersectional, right? People could be discriminated against based on their race, for sure. But people could also be discriminated against based on the fact that they have a disability. And perhaps they're being discriminated against based on both, or national origin, or the fact that they have kids, right? And so as we think about the community outreach piece, I think it's important to think about how people may be members or parts of, or of several of these protected class groups that are often or historically, let's say, marginalized. And so that took me up to module 4. Let me just go through the next 4 modules if I could. Now, module 5 in the toolkit is how to conduct fair housing planning data analysis. Module 6 is how to create the fair housing plan, right? And 7 is how to set fair housing goals and ensure meaningful actions to affirmatively further fair housing. And last and final module is the ultimate, right? Is implementing the Fair Housing Plan, right? And so before we had the 2015 version of Affordably Fairly Fair Housing, before we had our interim final, there were analysis of fair housing impediments that existed, right? But too often they just sit on the shelves and collected dust. And so implementing the actual fair housing plan, how to transform fair housing goals into action, that's module 8. And like I said, each one of these modules have objectives to them to help walk the reader through some of the suggestions on how to get there. And I think that this has been a tool that people have used. It's fairly new though, and understand that once we do have a final rule, this toolkit will be updated to reflect whatever is ultimately in that final AFFH rule. So I know that's a long-winded way to get to your question, Kellen, but I think it was really important because a lot of work has been put into this resource in order to help folks like you all.
No, it's very much appreciated. I know Arlington County joined a lot of its neighbors in Northern Virginia, DC, and Maryland over the last couple of years through the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments to develop the regional fair housing plan and then specific goals for each locality. And the NAACP was able to be a part of that process, and the advisory committee they put together, as well as some of the engagement and outreach that they did. And kudos to HUD for the technical assistance as part of that effort, as well as all the people from the local governments and from COG who were involved. Because I think we ended up with the most ambitious fair housing plan that we've ever seen for the region and definitely for Arlington County. And I think from the NAACP's perspective, we're really excited about the implementation steps now that that was adopted last year, how we can work with our local government and with the region to ensure that we're staying true to the promises that have been made, and that we're really moving towards incorporating equity into how we're doing housing policy programs, and stepping up things like fair housing enforcement, education and outreach when it comes to that. And so that kind of goes into my next question for you then, which is, what are some of the things that local governments can do to fight housing and discrimination within their communities?
Well, I would say, well, first of all, let me just say, well, kudos for you joining the regional planning process. And I have been reading about that various places. But since you're at the implementation stage, I will share the objectives for that last module 8 on implementation. So there are 3 objectives under that one, and that is learn when to incorporate the fair housing goals into subsequent planning processes, right? Because most likely there will be other planning processes that will take place along the lines, either from the housing agency perspective, from the county perspective, et cetera, et cetera. And so another objective there is also learn how to maintain records, right, of the types of actions and activities that have taken place. And also learn when to evaluate and revise, right? Because sometimes there are plans that exist, but things happen, right? And sometimes there are revisions that might be called for. So just highlighting that for you. And so I'm sorry, Colin, go ahead and restate that question for me again regarding.
Yeah. So the question is, what are some of the things that local governments can do to fight housing discrimination in their communities?
Yeah, I would say it's really important. I mean, these resources that we provide, both the FIP, the Home of Virginia, and the resources we provide, the FAPs, right, through your state, Fairfax County, that's in order to benefit the community. So I would say it'd be really important to connect there, to make sure that you are in conversation with those entities, because everything's very local. And so from a national federal perspective, it's not for us to say what's going on in detail locally, but I think that connecting with those types of entities and those types of folks would be hugely important. Going back to look at that plan, what did we say? What were the facts that informed that plan? Are those facts still the same? That's what I would say to that.
Thank you. One of the things that you touched on when you talked about the 8 modules was sort of the data collection and analysis around developing like a fair housing plan. Can you talk a little bit more about what localities can do, and maybe that's through that process to better understand what housing discrimination is happening in their communities, whether that's appraisal bias or lending discrimination, or as you brought up in your opening remarks about landlords discriminating against tenants based on sexual orientation or gender identity or their race. As we know, we've seen cases in Arlington County of landlords refusing to rent to someone because they didn't like their country of origin and their race. So what can localities do to better understand what's happening in their community when it comes to who's facing discrimination and at what scale?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't speak specifically to Arlington, Virginia, but I will say that some organizations I know put out like annual reports, what have you, about what's going on and what they've seen. And when I said earlier about connecting with your FIP, I think that's important. Let me just give you an example, because from a federal perspective, let me just say, I named 7 protected classes, right? And those are things that based on complaints that we received, okay? But also retaliation. I mentioned retaliation when the young lady was retaliated against once she tried to affect her fair housing rights. So let me just share that we have federal statistics, and they can break, if you connect with your FIP and your FAPS, you can figure out the local statistics of what people are seeing. And so from a federal perspective, we know that in fiscal 23, we had 5,090 disability cases that we handled nationally, right? Along with our FIPS. 2,142 were race-based cases, right? Retaliation, we had just over 1,000. Those based on sex, we had about 950. Those based on national origin, we saw about 695. When it comes to familial status, those folks with kids, we saw about close to 700. Based on color, about 320, and based on religion, about 185, and that totals is just over 8,000. Now, again, remember intersectionality, so some people file under more than one. And so to the extent that we know this from a national perspective, you can get that, if you work with your FIP and look at your FAPS and ask them what are the bases that they're seeing. But understand this though, Kellen, and this is where the community is really important. Everybody with a fair housing problem doesn't file a fair housing complaint, right? And so if you take it upon yourselves to connect with those entities, and maybe perhaps I've seen people do certain types of surveys, et cetera, to get a sense of what's on people's minds and what kind of troubles they're experiencing.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's something that we see in Arlington as well from talking to especially low-income residents who, in describing issues that they're facing with their landlords or property managers, they're describing housing discrimination, but they don't connect the dots that that's what it is. And also, many of them don't understand the process to file a claim.
Yeah, and let me just step in there and say that our FIP certainly has education outreach activities that they do, but our office here at headquarters, we have an education outreach team who can connect with you all if you'd like, and see, and because you guys are very close to us, you're not far from DC, to see if you have some kind of event or something, perhaps our education outreach team could provide some help and with passing out pamphlets and things of that nature, so that people do know their rights. They do know what phone number or email or website, I say email address, what website they can go to file a complaint, because the education and outreach piece is hugely important. But because we know when people are stressed and in a crisis, they may not necessarily take the time to file a complaint, because guess what? If they didn't get this housing to rent, they got to hurry up and find someplace else to rent, right? And that doesn't always leave time when you are dealing with your kids who've got to go to school, you got to go to work, maybe you have 2 jobs. But if we can help with anything related to education outreach, just please contact our office.
Thank you very much. Yeah, definitely will take you up on that offer. I think as many resources as we can bring to bear to ensure that people understand what their rights are, and when they face illegal discrimination and what to do about it, we're more than happy to do whatever we can to make that available to the community and the people who need it.
And certainly we know the long, amazing history of NAACP branches who themselves have stepped up and filed complaints based on what's going on, right? And so sometimes it may take an organization to sit back and see that there's a pattern or something going. I'm not saying that that's happening in Arlington, Virginia, but there are very known cases brought by NAACP branches.
Mhm. My next question is it kind of also traces back to one of the modules that you talked about with the fair housing or AFFH planning. Um, and so this is around historically marginalized populations. What can policymakers do to better engage with historically marginalized populations when making housing policy or planning decisions in their communities?
Yeah, so I'm not sure what level of policymakers you're talking about, but I'll tell you what we're doing as policymakers here at HUD. And it started with former Secretary Marcia Fudge. She made it clear to us that she wanted us to connect with people with lived expertise, right? Because to sit like kind of like in this vacuum and make policy that doesn't really connect with people is not the best way to go. We've seen that in the past, right? And so every day here, we are doing listening sessions, whether they be in person as we fly around the country, as I fly around the country and my colleagues fly around the country, talking to people. Secretary used to fly around the country, like talking to people. We've invited groups into our office in person to talk to them. So whether it be in person or virtual, listening to people with lived experience is hugely important. I just recently came back from Boston, where I connected with some folks who are returning to society, hearing the experiences that they have gone through, heart-wrenching, I must say, but certainly things that you have to stop and think, is there a policy fix there to address this? So I think making sure that there's that type of outreach, right? Knowing where to go is the first thing, right? Of where those marginalized populations are. And that Fair Housing Planning Toolkit really kind of touched upon it earlier, really kind of shares how important it is to touch people of all of those protected classes. Also, we have an Office of Public Engagement, which sits within our Office of Public Affairs, and their job is specifically to deal with public engagement. And so I think that that's hugely important, is getting on the ground, talking to people with the lived experiences.
Definitely agree that engaging folks who have the lived experiences is one of the best ways to help shape and formulate these policies and also review what's in place currently. And I know that um, during the regional fair housing planning efforts, it was really wonderful to see the focus groups that were happening and the outreach that took place to engage with communities who either were historically marginalized or we know our current targets of discrimination are facing that. And I think we got some really good data from that. Sometimes it's tougher to do that separately from a big regional planning effort when we're just looking at local policies and programs. But it's something that at the NAACP we keep pushing to local policymakers that it's so incredibly important to engage with the folks who aren't necessarily going to just show up at a board meeting or show up at a commission meeting and voice their opinion because they have free time and they're trying to figure out how best to spend it. So that's something that I know is really important to us, and we've been trying to communicate to our local policymakers that it's so important, even if it means more time and more money gets spent on the engagement efforts to connect with those folks who are harder to reach, but the ones who are really facing the most issues when it comes to whether it's affordable housing or fair housing. So that definitely resonates.
Well, and I would say, I mean, it's also a matter of trust, right? Like, why would they want to come? Why do they want to hear? So what are you offering? What is the setting in which you're doing that listening session, right? What is the time of day you're doing that listening session? Who is the moderator of that listening session, right? Is that somebody who can connect with the group that you're trying to reach? So all that comes into play. And sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes people are probably wondering, are you just gonna fly in and we're never gonna see you again, right? So perhaps is there a listening session that happens on a quarterly basis so that that trust can be built in over time? Excuse me.
No, thank you. Those are all very helpful things that we're happy to take back to to Arlington County and see what we can do to better engage with historically marginalized populations. My next question, and I know you talked about it again when or in your opening remarks, and something that is a pretty protracted issue in the United States, and that's segregation. And it's something that I feel like, especially local communities, really struggle with. How do we move forward with eliminating segregation in our neighborhoods and communities? In Arlington County, which is a very affluent community, we have gaps in life expectancy by up to 10 years in neighborhoods that are right next to each other, and often associated with um, differences in race and ethnicity in those neighborhoods. And the health outcomes can be quite different. Same thing, you look at employment rates. So what can communities do to move forward with ending segregation in our neighborhoods, and what is HUD providing as support on a national level to help move forward with ending segregation?
Yeah, well, that's there's a lot to that question, right? Because if we had all the answers, then we wouldn't have that problem right now. But I think first we lead with the word choice, right? Where people want to live, right? Because there are groups of people, particularly Black and brown people, who have been steered and told where they must live, particularly when that relates to the income levels that they have. And we know that just like you were saying, there are different, there's disparate numbers when it comes to health outcomes, there are disparate numbers when it comes to income, right? And so there are lots of tools different communities are trying to use. And it just depends on what's going on locally. Of course, ridding ourselves of segregation is part of the Fair Housing Act, right? And so to the extent that we do have a final rule that will be coming forth for folks who are going through that process, we will have technical assistance to help folks, but there are a number of national nonprofit advocacy fair housing groups that are working on these types of issues as well. It's not my place, as I sit here at HUD, to kind of list them out or sell them to anybody, right? But there are different tools that various folks are using. And I think that if you look at the Fair Housing Toolkit, that might be helpful. Yeah, that's what I would say on that. But there's lots of things as it relates to anything from, your housing stock. Where's your housing stock? Are there different income levels to different housing stocks, and based on where they're located and based on types of housing stock? And there could be some policy issues behind the answers to some of those questions, but it's not mine to say. That's very local. And we like to make sure, from a HUD perspective, that local folks are able to look at their local problems and use their local tools to address those problems. But there are groups out there who help with those types of things.
Thank you. My next question is around environmental justice, and so HUD, recently has been putting more of a focus on environmental justice. Um, can you talk about the intersection with fair housing and kind of what that looks like from HUD's perspective?
Sure. Well, the best way to describe it is based on the conciliation that I talked about a little earlier. As I mentioned before, too, though, the administration has the executive order on climate and environmental justice. So that's been something that's kind of been told to all the agencies that we need to pay attention to. When it comes to environmental justice, I got to say, I'm very proud of our staff. This conciliation that I'm about to tell you about really was the first of its kind in any recent history of memory that has come out of HUD. The bottom line is the city, there was a factory, so to say, for lack of a better word, in a majority white neighborhood that was being moved over to a majority Black and brown neighborhood because the neighbors had complained about it. And so with the city's blessings, for lack of a better word, it was going to be moved over to this Black and brown neighborhood that already had several other industrial types of activities taking place in it. And so from a local perspective, preachers, churches, community members fought back against the city. They eventually made a lot of noise. They filed a complaint with HUD. We took up the complaint. It was not so much under the Fair Housing Act as it was under Title VI. And so it's important to understand Title VI as well. As a matter of fact, this year is the 60th anniversary of Title VI because it was adopted in 1964. Title VI speaks to federal entities that receive federal funding as it relates to racial and national origin discrimination. And so our team took a good period of time doing quite a bit of research, looking at maps, looking at what's where, looking at the kind of the history that those decisions had gone through, and we're quite pleased that the city came to the table and negotiated, and we were able to get to a type of agreement. And so there is really, I think, good, robust relief out of that agreement, which includes steps that the city needs to take before they make those types of decisions again, right? Engaging the community, right? Looking at the in particular health outcomes, the health impacts of that type of move, of that type of factory. So we're really proud of that. That is on our website. If you go to if you Google FHEO press releases, you'll find a description in more detail on our website. But we're really, really proud. I can't be more proud of our staff that who worked on that.
Thank you so much for talking more about that. And I think the incorporating environmental justice in a lot of the different policy areas that as a NAACP chapter, we work on is incredibly important, and especially housing, making sure that those are interconnected as we pursue policy solutions. It's very important.
And like I said, like the complaint came from the community, so it's what people in the community are saying and seeing.
My next question goes back to sort of the AFFH and the oversight that HUD provides when it comes to implementation. So I know you talked about that there's an implementation module. What is HUD's role after the plan has been submitted and approved? And I don't know if this is getting too far ahead of the final rule or anything, and please, answer the way that you need to answer, given what's public and what is still pending. But what role does HUD have after a plan has been approved and the local government or communities in the implementation stage to make sure that it is moving forward based off of the goals and the strategies that had been agreed to?
And you're absolutely right. We just kind of have to all wait and see. That's a nail biter. So we'll wait and see until that final rule is published.
Okay, fair enough.
Good try, Colin. Good try. E for effort.
So it looks like we had a question in the chat from someone who is asking about first thanking you for your leadership at HUD. But they said you didn't mention where the environmental justice example was.
Chicago, city of Chicago.
Okay. Yep. Go.
Little small city.
Yeah. No stranger to fair housing issues and case studies written about things that have happened in Chicago that now impact a lot of the rest of the United States. Are there other things? I know we just have a couple minutes left. Other things that we haven't touched on thus far that you think are particularly important in light of Fair Housing Month, or things that you just want to reemphasize for, especially, we have a mix of some policymakers who are in this meeting,
yes,
some staff and advocates.
Well, I really appreciate that question because, like I said earlier, I could go on and on and on, but I just want to let people know, and I'll flag for people a couple of things. In addition to looking for that final rule to come out of HUD, you should also be looking for Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 relates to disabilities. The regulations for that have not in any significant way been updated since 1980. Now, that doesn't seem very far for an old person like me, but that was a long time ago. And so we're looking at getting out some rules regarding that. And like I said, I know you guys are the NAACP and probably focus a lot on raise, perhaps income. But let me tell you something. When we look at the statistics of people who are having to struggle with their disabilities, we know things are intersectional. And so I can't stress enough how I think it's really important for people of all communities to pay attention to some of these disability issues. And so that'll be coming out. Also, you should be looking out for an NPRM where we'll be seeking public comment as it relates to, not from my office, but from our public housing and multifamily offices. We'll be issuing a draft rule as it relates to really second chance reentry. So I think that might be something of interest to your folks and your branch. That should be coming out sometime soon too. So folks, really, I would say sign up for HUD's press releases on our listserv so that you can get that information. And we want to hear from people with lived expertise. And so since you're an organization, right, you can reach housing providers. We want to hear from everybody. You can reach people who may have family members, right, who have re-entered. You may reach people who are re-entering themselves and struggling with some issues. So we really want to hear from all corners of the universe as it relates to these both sets of things that will be coming out. So please, please, please watch for that.
Thank you for that. And related to the reentry policy, is that also related to the, I think it was 2015 or 2016 memo from HUD around how fair housing laws would apply to tenants with felony or other, criminal history?
So I think what you're referencing, Kellen, is the 2016 Office of General Counsel guidance
Yes.
as to the way past criminal convictions are treated as it relates to the Fair Housing Act. So actually that policy still exists. It's still important. Matter of fact, in June 2022, I kind of amplified that to let people know that's really important right now. But essentially, our former Secretary Fudge sent a memo to HUD a couple Februarys ago and told every office at HUD to look at all of our policies as it relates to second chances, right? And so that's what this coming rule is about.
Okay.
Personally, I issued a new rule that was published today, actually, published today as it relates to an FHEO set of policies regarding who our FIPS and FAPs could hire when they're looking for undercover testers to do fair housing testing. And so that's what our office issued just today. And so this draft rule is coming out of PIH, Public and Indian Housing Office, and Multifamily Office as it relates to their programs and who can be qualified, who should. I don't want to get into the draft rule because it hasn't been published yet, but that's kind of what the secretary told all of our offices to look at. What kind of things are creating unnecessary barriers for folks to access HUD programs?
Okay. That's super helpful. I think one final question before we wrap up, and that's just a question from the chat, is what can we do to grow the coalition supporting fair housing? And obviously it has such a significant impact, poor conditions or discrimination on a lot of people's lives. Any thoughts or recommendations on what we can do to grow the coalition of people who are caring about this issue and willing to put time and energy into making sure that we do more when it comes to affirmatively furthering fair housing and implementing it?
Well, Kellen, I'm going to say you guys are the experts. I would look to you, right? And so I would say, talk about it, talk about it, talk about it. Think about this. Think about when we first had Obamacare. Every nonprofit, every church, everybody in the world was talking about healthcare, right? And so could we do that as it relates to fair housing issues, right? Housing is huge. Housing actually has grown part of people's conversation since the pandemic, honestly, right? And I'll be honest, my personal view is that because more people than usual were touched by housing issues. And so I think now is the time to grab hold of this moment and talk about housing. If you're talking about housing, then you're necessarily also talking about fair housing issues. So I look to you all as the experts for that.
Thank you. We try, and we're always looking to grow our membership for the NAACP. And so for anyone who lives in Arlington and is not a member of the NAACP, we welcome you to sign up and become members. So I wanted to first of all, thank you very much, Demetria, for your time today and your remarks. This was very informative, and it's gotten me even more excited about fair housing. And I want to give a plug for the third annual Arlington Fair Housing Conference, which will be on Saturday, April 20th from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. at the H.B. Woodlawn School Building in Rosslyn. And I will put the sign up for that in the chat. And I also wanted to give a plug for the upcoming school board candidate forum on April 15th at 6:30 that the NAACP Arlington branch is also hosting. And I just wanted to lastly thank our elected officials who were in attendance, Matt DeFronti and Susan Cunningham from the Arlington County Board. And apologies if I missed anyone else who was attending who was then elected. But yeah, thank you so much, Demetria, and thank you to everyone who attended.
I'm trying to put a couple of links here in your chat before.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds good. We'll try to send it out to the people who signed up
Okay.
for it as well. So yeah, thank you and have